We're back on unsupervised learning with another part of our recurring series with Ari from Datology and Rob from Radical, where we hit on the big questions in AI today. We talked about Andrej Karpathy's recent comments about agents and how they're overhyped in the short term, as well as whether we're in a bubble today. We talked about OpenAI, all the things they've shipped from Sora to the Apps SDK to the browser and a bunch of other things. We talked about the compute deals that have been struck and getting reactions to those, as well as potential acquisition targets for Apple. And then finally, we hit on the AI app ecosystem and what's interesting and not as interesting from an investing perspective. It's just a ton of fun to get to do this with two good friends who are so smart in the AI space. I think folks will really enjoy it. Without further ado, here's our conversation. Guys, this is awesome. I'm so glad we're doing this again.
We're running it back.
Yeah, really excited to get to do it again and in person this time.
Yeah, this time in person always way better. That way we can get, super dramatic reactions to especially bad takes. You can stand up, you can kind of
storm
gesture
out
toward
in
the other
fury.
person.
So what's the over under until one of us storms out of the room?
Hopefully if the questions are good by mid-interview, something bad should have been said. I think to kick it off, I feel like the dominant question of the last few weeks, really the last few months, has been, are we in a bubble? And there always seems to be some net new data point that people use to react to that. But the latest is another podcast appearance from Andrej Karpathy, where he said some really interesting things. I'll read some of the quotes that I found compelling. I think it's probably best summarized by him saying, look, overall, the models are not there. I feel like the industry is making too big of a jump and is trying to pretend like this is amazing, and it's not. It's slop. He also said it'll take at least a decade until AI can meaningfully automate entire jobs, like an employee or intern that you'd hire to work with. And so obviously a pretty different narrative than some of the stuff we've been hearing out of the labs. Curious, both of you, what was your reaction to what Andrej was saying?
I think I would start by saying I think it's still a pretty hypey, Andrej Karpathy is still pretty hypey on AI. I think it's kind of wild that saying AGI will get here in 10 years and we'll be able to fully automate all work in 10 years means there's a bubble. That's a crazy statement. If you had told me that 5 years ago, with high confidence in 15 years we would automate all work, that would be the biggest technological advancement ever. So maybe it's more a commentary on how ridiculously overhyped things have been, but my take on this generally is that, yes, there's absolutely some overhyping going on. I think, we talk to people who think that they have 2 years to make money before nobody makes money anymore because everything is fully automated. That's obviously not true. If nothing else, it takes a million years for anything to actually disseminate through the enterprise. And just enterprises and big companies are slow, and it will take a long time to actually see the real world impacts in a lot of these cases just because of that pace. So, my take is, there are some people overhyping things, but there's still very, very real substance going on here. If we stop making models better today, this is fixed, this is all we can ever do, we would still see a massive transformation throughout the economy. This is putting a splash of water on some of the really overhypey stuff, sure, but there's still real substance where we are in a way that is very different, for example, than the dot-com bubble.
10 years to AGI is pretty exciting, but obviously there's concerns in the short term that are we overshooting with the amount of capital being put into some of these data centers? And I think what's not clear is right now, do you kind of need enterprise agents and the ability to replace work to justify this latest level of reported CapEx spend? We could be headed on this incredible long-term path, and if some of the stuff doesn't show up in the short term, kind of unclear if we'll see the revenues needed to justify this next wave of CapEx investment.
I loved the Andrej Karpathy interview. I thought it was great. To Ari's point, I think it was quite optimistic. I think if you listen to the interview, he's not bearish on AI. He's not saying AI is a bubble. I think it just was a very refreshing, balanced, candid take on the areas in which AI still falls down and the very real challenges that still need to be met. And, we're not, at least right now, in this fast takeoff scenario where AGI is going to be here in 6 months. And it's, I think it was helpful to hear someone of his stature openly acknowledge that and say it. In terms of the question of being in a bubble, it has kind of felt to me like a bubble for at least the past 2 or 3 years in some ways. And so I do think that there are a lot of elements of a bubble that are happening now, but I don't know if that, I don't know if it's necessarily the most interesting observation. I would almost go so far as to say that whenever there's a really transformative new paradigm shifting technology, a bubble is inevitable because people get so excited about imagining the long-term potential and dream the dream and kind of get ahead of themselves. And, you know, the financial cycle kind of decouples from the technology cycle. And I think we've seen this play out with, you know, basically every major technology of our lifetimes and before our lifetimes. There are, from the VC and startup perspective, there are a lot of echoes of the 2020, 2021 ZERP era, which we both lived through, like just in terms of how quickly rounds are getting done and the crazy valuations and so forth. Like all of that is real. The one last point, which you touched on, Jacob, which I think is worth acknowledging, is like where it gets potentially a little bit more serious is when you start introducing more and more leverage into the system. And I do think that has started to happen just recently in the context of this like massive CapEx build out of AI data centers. And there is just like more and more debt that's being taken on and bigger capital commitments that are being made.
I'm curious, Ari, you know, in the research community, obviously there's some very loud voices from the labs always being like, agent, this is the year of agents, like this stuff all works. And Andrej, it kind of felt like was saying a little bit of the quiet part out loud, but is that a correct characterization?
Yeah, I think that's true for many of the folks that I chat with. Also, just like generally social media will, you know, incentivize extreme takes and will amplify extreme takes over general moderate takes. So saying, hey, we're 1 year away, that's going to be really compelling. There's still a lot of work to be done to get, especially on these specialized domains, really accurate performance of these models. Like, I agree with Andrej completely. This will happen. Like, the trend line is incredibly positive. But when you go to things like these giant data center build-outs, you know, it does give me a bit of pause. One reason, honestly, is just that I think constraints breed innovation. And I'm not sure if the strategy of just throw more compute infinitely is the right one. I think as just one example, we've seen that just like naively scaling models up to really big scales like GPT 4.5, like Llama Behemoth, didn't work that well. Yeah. The answer was instead to go to MOEs, which are a lot more efficient in a lot of ways. We see what DeepSeek was able to do with, you know, GPUs that were not as powerful as, you know, what NVIDIA is producing right now. I think those constraints are actually important, and I think there's a lot of ways to make AI a lot better without necessarily needing to invest, you know, $500 billion in data center infrastructure.
I mean, it feels like the entire data center build out today, you're betting, you know, what are the use cases that really work? I mean, almost all the revenue, right, is from either a consumer chatbot or from coding. I think part of the reason people are hyping agents is you kind of, maybe those two have endless room to run and they'll find great ways to monetize Sora and Vibes and all these other things. And so those two alone can justify this massive data center build out. But there's certainly this feeling, I think, that you'll need to see pretty large enterprise agent revenue to, you know, justify this level of spend.
Although even in consumer, right, there's a question of actually getting people to pay for these models. There's an interesting analysis of trying to reverse engineer OpenAI's revenue, and that there's actually a very small fraction of ChatGPT customers that are paying. And like I'll say personally, in my family, the normies in our lives that aren't obsessed living living in the AI news landscape, they use ChatGPT constantly, and like they don't pay for it. Yeah. And I've asked them like, why not? And they say like, do I need to? They don't understand what a thinking model is for or any of this stuff. They're just like,
they don't understand the amount of CapEx we put into these data centers.
Like you have to pay for it to justify for the data centers. Come on. So, you know, I do wonder whether the subscription-based model like will scale beyond a certain subset of the population.
They've been super, you know, active, I think, at Dev Day most recently, you know, introducing this apps SDK, and then also, you know, I think introducing kind of checkout through ChatGPT. And, you know, there's certainly a way to monetize the commerce side of some of these things.
It's just incredible to watch the velocity with which OpenAI shifts. Like, it really is impressive. I think the apps SDK and the browser are like just the latest examples of this. The Atlas launch was fascinating to see, just because it's interesting to watch it's almost like a Back to the Future moment with browsers and the browser wars from the 1990s. Like for like 20 or 25 years, browsers were kind of static and irrelevant. And all of a sudden there's so much innovation happening again with the browser, and so many ways you can tweak and add new AI native functionality. Obviously Perplexity has their version, Comet, and you know, there are other startups that are innovating around this. And I was just playing around with Atlas yesterday, and like it's an awesome product. Like I would expect that I will stop using my like traditional Google Chrome browser and start using an AI native browser.
Yeah, I think that's another interesting axis, right? Like you basically do everything in your daily life in something that's associated with one of the model providers. And then it makes it easier to monetize the aspects that are not actually the answer engine itself, right? So then it makes shopping make a lot more sense. I think the question, will be, can you actually get people to switch on to entirely new browsers?
Right.
Like Chrome is very sticky for a reason, right? It's very hard to get people to switch. So, can you actually do that, or will that just benefit to the folks that have the most distribution, which are going to be Google and Apple primarily, right?
Yeah. And I think also maybe on the app side, it's like, will some of these other companies play nice? I mean, you're kind of being obviated to like and obviously I know that you still go to interact in the Canva experience or Zillow or whatever the ones they were showing, but it's easy enough for them to decide which app they show you and switch those out. And so, I do wonder whether, you take a company like Uber, it's like, you could say the strength of Uber is just like the logistics network, of like the fact that they will have cars at good prices, and like they should be fine if they're, if ChatGPT should choose them every time. At the same time, I think they love having this consumer front end that you go to. You weren't thinking about maybe ordering delivery while you were getting your food or couriering something, and basically having that, front end relationship with you.
I have a feeling this is part of why Mark Zuckerberg has been spending so much on AI and AI talent, is that he really missed out on getting a platform in mobile. And I think that really burned Meta and Facebook in a lot of ways, most notably when Apple did the ATT change to make it harder to attribute whether a user bought an app because of an ad that was shown through a Meta property. And that cost Meta many, many, many tens of billions of dollars. In some ways, if you don't own the platform around this, it's a bit of an existential threat to your business, right? Like, that's very scary for Shopify if all of shopping happens through ChatGPT or through Gemini or these various things. So I have a feeling that like a big part of why Mark is willing to invest so deeply is because he's a bit traumatized by not having owned a platform in the first place. And now he's trying to make sure. And I think Oculus was a lot of the same thing. He wanted to make sure to own the platform for AR and VR. And
now doing the same thing with glasses.
And now the same thing in glass, which I think honestly is where you're going to, like, now that these are coming out, this is where the metaverse spending was always going. And I think it's going to be quite cool. But yeah, for a lot of companies, I think it's a big threat to not kind of own this ecosystem. And I think there's also the threat, right, that the big models players will actually cut off your access if you start to compete with them in a big way, right? So thinking about like Anthropic and Windsurf, that would be terrifying to me if I were building an app that was completely reliant on one of these models. And then as soon as there's the hint of maybe you're competing with them, they then can cut off access for you.
There is this very strong frenemy dynamic where like you don't not want to be working with OpenAI, but you are risking being sidelined and marginalized if you do. And I think it'll be very interesting to watch it play out.
Yeah. It's amazing how incentivized everyone is in the ecosystem for there to be like as many players as possible. Like obviously you've seen OpenAI and the infrastructure deals they're doing, like trying to make sure they're not just relying on NVIDIA long term. And then certainly NVIDIA very incentivized to make sure there's as many different model providers out there as possible. Like nobody wants there to be a world where, one model is so much better or one consumer front end is like the place that people go.
And I think we see that differentiation is not going to happen at the model layer anymore,
yeah.
Right? Like the open source models are now very competitive with closed source models, especially for most of the use cases that real people actually care about. Most people don't care about solving AIM. Like that's not relevant to all but a very, very small handful of the world. So if now you have commodity models that are just as good or most things as the closed source models, then the only place to differentiate is the ecosystem that you build around the model itself, and going to kind of that sticky scaffolding, the memory aspect of things, which I think will be a very sticky aspect. And I think that's why you're seeing all of these folks rush to try to capture this because it's existential.
The other big news the last month has been Sora and the video models more generally, and OpenAI just continues to be in the zeitgeist in such an impressive way. I mean, I feel like Google was first with like these very impressive video models they had, and then OpenAI kind of found a fun, like, obviously great models, but also like a very fun consumer experience and the ability to insert yourself into it. Meta was also doing a similar product with Vibes. Like, curious your reaction to one, just the progress we've had in video models over the last 3-6 months, and then where it kind of feels like all the stuff's headed.
Yeah, honestly, it's been amazing to see how good Sora 2 is, how good Veo 3 is, and yeah, just the pace of improvement continues to be really amazing. I think we have like relatively recently crossed the threshold where video generation is effectively near or at parity in terms of realistic appearance, which is which is a crazy big picture.
You really saturated that Will Smith spaghetti.
That happened. It feels like it happened like in the blink of an eye. But I feel like for years, one of the big concerns that people have had, or sort of like doomsday type scenarios, downside scenarios of AI, is this concept of deepfakes, and like the line between reality and fiction blurring beyond recognition, because you can produce something that looks like it's real and it's not real, and it's impossible to know what is and isn't real. And you can imagine scenarios of like videos of politicians saying certain things, ruining their careers, or all sorts of things if you can just instantly generate content kind of at will. And I think we're like there for, I can remember like 8 or 9 years ago in the late 2010s, a lot of hand-wringing around deepfakes, but like the technology just wasn't nearly good enough. And I think we have finally gotten to that point. And I think we haven't yet really seen it like trickle out all the way through society. Obviously, there have been like early experimentations with Sora that have been fun, and like Sam Altman stealing GPUs from a Best Buy, which is a great one. But like it is kind of mind-blowing and exciting, but also a reason for pause to think about like what will the world look like when you genuinely just can't tell that any given piece of content, any video, any image, any piece of audio is real or not. And I do think like there's a lot of downsides. There obviously are a lot of exciting upsides too. Like you guys probably saw that OpenAI is producing like a feature-length feature film that's going to debut at Cannes next year, which they're doing in like 9 months for under $30 million. It usually takes several years and way bigger budgets to make these films. So like, there's a lot of exciting opportunities and ways in which this is going to empower creatives. But I think just like having crossed that Rubicon of like the true indistinguishability between AI generated videos and real life videos, I think will be like there will be a lot of fallout from it.
Yeah, piggyback on the deepfake thing, I was definitely one of these people that have been very, very concerned about deepfakes, more so than almost any other near-term impact of AI. I'm really pleasantly surprised that it hasn't been a major problem yet. Most people can't distinguish images or videos already. You look on Facebook, and there are all these groups where people are just posting, AI generated images, and like a bunch of generally older people are completely fooled by these things. They've been at the stage of technology where they can do this effectively for a while, and like certainly state actors have access to these models. They know how to do this, and yet we haven't seen it really be a big problem. I'm really surprised by that, and perhaps heartened. Maybe I'm speaking too soon, and like in a year, this will be a really big problem. But I would have expected this to already have been a bigger problem than it is. You also get some like weird in-between cases. Like I've seen now people making AI-generated videos where they show a politician saying something that they did actually say, but there wasn't a video of. So you make a video version of someone saying something that they gave a quote in a newspaper, and it's like, should that should that be fully fake? It's somewhere in between. It's not misattributing a comment to someone that they didn't say.
I mean, I feel like another part of the discourse around these video models has just been like slop has become like the word of the past few weeks.
Yep.
And, there was obviously some negative reactions to the Meta launch. Around like it kind of feeling like a lot of these things were just like mindless consumption. And I think Sam Altman put it eloquently where he said one man's slop might be another man's treasure.
I think it's just an inevitable consequence of having a transformative tool, right? Like ultimately AI is like the best hammer that you could ever build, right? And hammers are awesome because you can use hammers to build things. You can use hammers to build houses and really do amazing things for people. You can also use hammers to crack people's skulls. Like any tool and any new technology, there are ways that you can use it for good. There are ways you can use it for bad. And most of the uses, I would say, are neither good nor bad, but are just kind of neutral and people enjoy, right? So I think like the AI slop, like I imagine people will get really into it, and it will be really sticky, right? It's like if you imagine TikTok is actually going and now looking through its library of content to try to find something that matches you most versus saying, hey, let's generate exactly what you think you will like the most. That's probably going to be more effective once it gets to a certain point. Is that where I would necessarily want all of the time and energy to go? Like, no, I'd probably rather it go towards solving disease, or building better tools that enable us to do good things for humanity. But I think it's also just an inevitable consequence of any new technology that we're going to find ways to use it that are mostly time wasters, and that's what most people in the world, I think, want with these sorts of things.
Yeah, I like Sam's quote actually. What one man's slop is another man's treasure. Like I do think that it's just, as Ari said, it's just inevitable that when the generation of any sort of content, whether it's written content or videos or images, the cost goes to basically zero and the time goes to zero. Like there's going to be way more of it, and like that's going to happen inevitably. But like I don't know, I think like even before the era of generative AI, like a lot of what was on your Twitter feed or your Facebook feed, like you could rightly characterize as like human generated slop. That's also like not that profound or meaningful. And I think like that's maybe more criticism of social media overall. So I do think that like there's a lot of societal reckoning that will need to happen around like now that we can just endlessly produce all this content, all this code, all written essays, books, videos, etc. How do we I think there's a huge effort around curation that will be necessary, and like filtering and deciding what content you want to see.
I think one interesting question, like one of the areas that, and also Karpathy talked about this and what he's spending all of his time on, which I think is awesome. One of the most exciting areas for AI's usage to kind of making the world better, I think, is having an infinitely patient, infinitely intelligent tutor in your pocket at any given time. And in particular, I think this is going to be so impactful for people in lower income countries. So one question I kind of have is like, how can we make it so that, edutainment is more entertaining through AI? I think that'd be a really cool thing. And I wonder if that's sort of some of the ways we can guide this towards more productive outcomes for society.
Your point earlier was well taken, that like when you have a technology like this, it gets used in a bunch of different ways. And I think actually in some ways the initial manifestation of it in ChatGPT was in its best way can be like kind of a bicycle for the mind type thing, where you're like really accelerating the way you're learning about things and getting access to things. The like potential of just scrolling endlessly through random AI generated videos feels like one of the first more like doomy or not so clearly positive versions. And even within these creator applications, I feel like there's there's this battle almost between the Sora approach, which is like you're still kind of like creating things and it's like social in some way because it's about you or people in your own life. Most consumer apps, traditionally, people want to just be consumers. They don't really want to be creators. They want to just sit there and like observe a lot of stuff or listen to a lot of things. And I think there's a lot of people who are very inspired to build consumer apps where lots of people are creating. And I'll be really interested to see whether it's just a human nature thing. If you give people like the greatest creative tools out there, do most people want to make their short form videos or something? Or like, I'm actually just fine watching Rob's really good at it and like he makes some pretty good ones. And like, is from a normative perspective, like, does it really matter?
It's a very interesting question that you asked, Jacob. And I feel like that question is like kind of a microcosm of the broader question that people always grapple with in the context of super intelligent AI that can do everything better than humans can do, and therefore humans don't have to work anymore. And work is no longer necessary to kind of generate the resources you need to survive. And the question of like, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is it a good thing for people to just like go to the beach and spend time with their family? And if they want to create, they can create. And if they want to learn, they can learn. Or if they don't want to, they can just play video games, and that's fine too. Like, I'm a little bit more in the latter camp, that I think it's okay if some people don't want to use these tools to create and they like get enjoyment out of them just by consumption.
Yeah. I mean, I thought one thing that was most interesting about the dialogue around all this when the meta stuff came out is it felt like there was almost an appeal to, this small subset of researchers that are, compelling enough to work on these problems of like, do you really want to be working on that? Like, there's something you could work anywhere. Like, is that the kind of thing you want to work on?
I also think it doesn't really matter, to be honest. Like, okay, all the top researchers that are working on these products say, hey, I'm not going to work on these. Like, I'm only going to work on things that, really benefit society. Maybe it slows it down by like 6 months. Like, this is all inevitable at this point. I think also a lot of like the safety like ideas of like pause AI. I'm generally not someone who's super concerned about that, but it also just like it's not realistic. Like, you can't pause any of these things. They are happening. You can maybe slow them down very, very slightly, but there are so many groups that know how to do this at this point. It's going to happen no matter what.
We're talking about obviously this AGI future and maybe going to the beach, and then you see headlines that feel a little bit divorced from that. One recently that I was very excited to get your thoughts on, Ari, because you're our data expert, is I feel like it's been making waves that OpenAI is like hiring these bankers and paying them to train models, and I think people feel this juxtaposition of like, wait a second, you say you're like 2 years away from AGI, and then at the same time, like we have bankers coming, like you're focused on like Excel models, and kind of like marry those two for me. I'm curious, maybe first, Is that data gathering exercise in your mind, is it like crucial to just improve models overall? Is it like really is the way to think about it, hey, it just makes them better in finance tasks?
And in general, we've seen a trend in kind of the data acquisition from more general purpose to much more specialized, right? And we've also seen that the folks who actually do the data acquisition that are better at targeting specialized talent have gotten more business relative to the folks that are better at just getting generic talent. So, this is, I think, just one example of a trend that's been happening for the last couple of years already, moving towards more specialized use cases. I think the question is, right, where's the economically valuable work that is within reach of AI right now? Obviously, software-based approaches are a lot closer right now than physical world based jobs. And then finance is obviously a place where there's a lot of value for this, but there isn't actually very much of this data that exists on the public internet. The public internet's like a very biased sample of all the data in the world. One thing that I'm kind of fond of saying oftentimes is that the vast, vast majority of data in the world is private. It's not public. It's not on the public internet. And that's relevant for a lot of these specialized use cases. And by default, OpenAI doesn't have access to that data because most enterprises are very, very reticent about sharing that data with anybody and are especially reticent about sharing it with the frontier labs for worries that they're going to train on that data and then use it to serve other customers or undermine their core business. So, I actually think it's not particularly striking. Like, it's kind of course they're doing that. Of course they're trying to get data that's on these very specialized tasks. Whether or not that will have some generalization to making models better more broadly, we have seen this happen for some sorts of data. In particular, math and code tends to be really good at encouraging reasoning more generally. So you might see that with these sorts of finance tasks.
I feel like we'll be able to answer the age-old question of like, is banking a good first job out of school? It's like do those skills of building models generalize to other things?
I would guess probably not in the near future. and like honestly, that's actually one of my biggest worries with AI is more that when you have bankers who are in their late 40s, early 50s, say they did everything right. They went to a great school. They worked really hard. They did all the things that you're supposed to do to have a successful life and get a high-paying job. I don't think all of them are going to go out of work, and I don't think it's going to happen in a year. I think it's going to take a long time. But eventually, a lot of those folks will go out of work, and there'll be a narrower set of folks that are able to do the same amount of work just relying on AI. And then I think it'll actually probably create new jobs where there are new things that you can use to build on top of AI, where we still will want humans involved. But those jobs will require a very different skill set than the jobs for the bankers in their late 40s and early 50s who are going to be out of work. And that's, I think, to me, one of the scariest kind of medium-term implications of AI, when you have all of those folks who are now dissatisfied and feel like they did everything right and got screwed anyway.
Well, I think the risk is actually much more at the junior level, right? I actually think, if you're automating Excel modeling, I don't think a senior banker spends too much of their time like in the weeds of cell C137. Like they're much more, they're doing the relationship side of things. And I think even the CEO of Goldman was like, look, these models can do 95% of an S1 now. And like, it's really the extra, that 5% on top of it. I think you'll give them a lot more leverage first. I don't worry as much for the 40, 50-year-olds as I do for like the 22-year-olds that like need that kind of training or traditionally have had that kind of training to get into the spot where the 40 and 50-year-olds are.
The reason I'm a little bit less worried about junior folks is that they are much more open to learning new things.
Yeah.
Right. So like one of the things that was really surprising to me is that job retraining programs generally don't work. You'd think that they would really work. And like if you look at a lot of the studies of like the job retraining programs that happened after the financial crisis, for example, to try to get auto workers to learn new skills, like it didn't work very well at all. So I think when you're young, when you're under 30, it's easy. Okay, this isn't working. You pick up a new skill, you learn how to use AI well, and then you're able to do something new. And obviously there are people that are older who are always, lifelong learners and always want to be learning new things. But I think on average, willingness to learn new tasks goes down with age.
Maybe the reason the finance headline struck a chord, I agree with you. It's not all that surprising. It's like where all the data purchasing has been done over the last year. It's just, again, this juxtaposition with it feeling like, man, this might be, a decade-long process to get to these enterprise agents. And if we were on the cusp of having all of them, maybe we wouldn't need to go into like each specific area. And then I think also back to this question of the CapEx build, if you think about each of these verticals and the push to build models in them, does it end up justifying the overall spend? Because I think there'll, in my mind, almost inevitably be a layer in between OpenAI and the other foundation model companies and financial firms. I don't think the financial firms will really use the model out of the box. I think it will be like mediated through Rogo or some of these other application companies. And so
Heavia,
excuse me. And so I guess like, is when you're sitting at a $500 billion valuation to like each of these, coding and consumer are like the two best end markets. And I wonder, finance a massive market, healthcare, legal, these other ones certainly are. Are they enough to like continue to move the needle both as these companies continue to grow into, more valuations they want, but also, the assumptions behind the CapEx spend?
Yeah, I mean, I think this kind of comes back to the question, to the bubble discussion of like,
everything does.
Is there enough? Are there enough use cases? I think the answer in the fullness of time will certainly be yes. Like I have very little doubt about that. But I think you're pointing out, Jacob, that like the near-term timeline is a lot more uncertain. Like it may not be the case that AI can create many billions of dollars of value across finance and law and healthcare in the next 12 to 18 months. And if that's the case, like might nearer term security prices and share prices go up and down?
Even if it can just automate honestly a fraction of all the knowledge work, like it can create this amount of value, especially over a multi-year time span.
And this is still us just focusing on like white collar knowledge digital work. I think there's also like a much bigger portion of the economy and the world GDP is physical related work, and robotics obviously is trailing behind language models and purely digital models, but the application of cutting edge AI to robotics is improving very quickly. And so, a lot of these data centers that are being built out can and will be used to train the next generation of robotics models and the next after that. And I think that, again, on the right time horizon, that opens up just so much more value creation.
I mean, if robotics models hit in the next few years, we're underbuilding data centers dramatically.
Yeah.
Yep. And I think that's the thing, right? You don't have to not too many things have to go right before it's all justified. And it's not everything that has to go right in order to justify it. I mean, I think ultimately the real key will be, can you really monetize this effectively to all the consumers? Even if you can do that, it justifies it. And then if you can actually make the penetration into the enterprise for this high value work, I think it can very easily justify it.
One thing I'd love both your thoughts on is actually like the Google Anthropic relationship. It's like so interesting to me. We talked about this last time. Like Google's cooking. Like they've got a great team. They're building great models. Everyone's saying Gemini 3 is going to be really good. They've obviously, invested a ton into Anthropic in the past. And I think there's been these reports in the last few days that they're planning to invest a bunch more. What do you guys make of that?
My 2 cents, I'm curious what Ari thinks. Like my interpretation of the recent rumors around the Google Anthropic, like deepening of ties was much more that it was about TPUs and about Google Cloud and about like striking a deal for Anthropic to shift a lot of its compute spend to TPUs. And I think Google like really wants to build out its cloud business and make TPUs like a viable alternative to NVIDIA's GPUs. I do think, and I'm curious, Ari, what you think, and Jacob, any thoughts, but I don't think that Google, like I do think that Google has a lot of confidence in its own homegrown models and is not thinking like, oh, maybe we'll need to lean on Anthropic. I think it is much more about the hardware.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. I also think it's just a hedge on both sides, right? Like Anthropic wants to diversify its compute infrastructure, so it's not reliant on Amazon for everything. Google already owns, I think, 10% of Anthropic, maybe a bit more, and now gets a lot of the upside from Anthropic. Also, like is going. I think Gemini is like long term. My assumption is going to be built into the phone. It's a local model. That's where the distribution comes in advantage. They integrate it very tightly with Gmail and G Suite and Calendar, and it becomes your chief of staff and all of that sort of stuff. That just seems very kind of direct line of sight for Google and Gemini. Whereas Anthropic's focusing more on going to developers and the coding use cases, which I think Google cares about, but I would guess they care about less. So I think there's also a bit of a complementary aspect to this. So honestly, I think it's a very smart deal it's a very smart idea on both sides. And then I agree with Rob. Like Google's looking at NVIDIA's massive concentrated demand, and TPUs are really good. People really like TPUs. There are challenges with getting everything to work well on TPUs, but if you're doing one of the things that TPUs are really good at, they're awesome. So selling that and actually productionizing it makes a lot of sense. And honestly, it's kind of cool to see Google now starting to think about entirely new revenue streams, which they didn't for a long time. And like they're hitting it now, right? With Waymo really is hitting hard, obviously. And I would have no trouble imagining that selling TPUs becomes extremely lucrative for Google.
I mean, it feels like there's just like lots of hedging on all sides, where again, everyone's incentivized to have multiple options here. Nobody wants to be single threaded.
Yep.
You keep flipping over cards every 3-6 months and you see, what the next generation model capabilities are, the next generation of chips. And the more options you can keep to have. I mean, obviously, I think Google's pretty directly competitive with OpenAI at this point. And so I think why not have, it seems like Gemini models are going well, but you never know. And it's interesting to see this, a lot of like frenemies in the ecosystem, a lot of like deals that it's like unclear, are these like actually, set in stone? Are they more just like optionality in the future? There's some serious chess being played.
Totally. Yep.
Obviously, there's been a ton of these announcements over the last, 3 months, OpenAI and insert any company that stock is then up 30% right after. But obviously AMD, NVIDIA, Broadcom, like of all these, announcements between the infra players, the model players, any strike you guys, and what do you make of the whole thing?
I mean, I've been incredibly impressed with OpenAI and Sam Altman's deal making in recent months. Like they have struck a flurry of deals. I think exactly as you described it, Jacob, like it is about maximizing optionality. I think the way those deals were structured has done a great job of like almost making OpenAI like too big or too interconnected to fail, which I think was like brilliantly executed by them. I think the Broadcom deal I think is interesting for another reason. It's less about this like the circularity of investment and NVIDIA giving OpenAI money to spend on GPU chips and so forth. I think it seems like it points in the direction of customized silicon being more and more relevant, and maybe even like customized silicon for each new model as the windows for developing new chips and then taping them out and then using them gets more compressed. It's interesting to think about a world where like, are you able to kind of like co-create the silicon and the models and, have new generations of chips pretty quickly? I think that's the direction OpenAI wants to go in. And I think they found a good partner in Broadcom. And I think it in large part goes back to the theme that we've been talking about, which is like OpenAI feels uneasy being so dependent on NVIDIA and would prefer to own its own destiny on the silicon front. So I think that one is a really interesting one to watch.
Yeah.
I very much like, Rob's point about by OpenAI tying itself to many other companies, they are kind of making themselves too big to fail in some ways. I think there's definitely something to that. And, that makes these deals, I think, make a lot of sense. I think the other thing is, fundamentally, you're making a bet that OpenAI will have access to enough capital to be able to pay off these deals when they come due.
Yep.
And Sam Altman is very good at finding capital. So, to some extent, even if you're just betting on Sam Altman's ability to raise more capital such that he'll be able to keep it going, then these deals can make sense.
I guess shifting gears to the application landscape, wanted to get your guys' thoughts on a few things. I think last time we didn't hit on vibe coding, which has obviously been one of the use cases that seems to be growing super fast. Obviously, there's been a lot of folks, beginning that you've had Lovable and Replit and Bolt kind of grow really fast. And then Figma's kind of entered this space with their Make product. And you've had Cursor kind of like begin to introduce some things here as well. Curious, both of you, like, what do you think happens to this vibe coding space long term?
It's kind of interesting to see, talking to some of the folks on the team at Datology. Some of the ICs feel like they've become managers. They're just like managing a swarm of agents now, and that's become their job. I think one thing that we've seen is you definitely still need quite a lot of human oversight to get good results out of these. And Andrej Karpathy was saying the same thing in his podcast, right? That he likes it for autocomplete and less actually for chatting with the model and asking it to do something. I think that's consistent with what our experience has generally been. It's like that's where it can kind of really accelerate things. But I do expect that we will see some like big security vulnerabilities, especially in like mid-stage companies that are going to come out of vibe coding. And there is still a gap. But this is clearly where most of the frontier labs focus is right now, is how do you get these to longer time horizons? They've already improved dramatically in the last year or two. I expect we'll continue to see more and more reliability here, especially as we start shifting to more kind of specialized coding models that are really good at coding and therefore are going to hallucinate less because they're a little bit less general purpose.
Yeah. What's your take on vibe coding, Jacob?
I feel like you can like bifurcate the use cases into like there's two visions, and one of them I believe in way more, which is that it's just a far more effective like prototype or mock-up, and like why put something as a mock-up if you can literally get a 90% as good version just to show people, and it's going to kind of change the way that you start the process of creation. And that's obviously a very lucrative opportunity. The idea of like vibe coding an app straight to production. I mean, to your point, there's security side, but there's also just like so much of software is maintenance and like, okay, who actually knows how to keep this thing, and it broke in this way like a year or two later, like who knows how to do that. And to the extent that you've had no involvement whatsoever in creating it, I'm not sure it actually ends up saving that much money or time in the long term on the application side. But we'll see. I don't know. These models keep getting a lot better. So
it makes reviewing code a much more important skill set.
yes,
like it's always been an important skill set, but like, there's always this like idea that, code's going to be read far more often than it's going to be written. Like that's even more true probably now than it ever was. And, I think hiring people who are really good at monitoring these models and kind of building intuitions for where they go off the rails and how you can defend against that, that skill set I think is becoming increasingly valuable.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do think though, like as time goes by, like all these things that we're describing are things that AI will be better at than humans eventually. Like code review is something that is already being automated and will become increasingly automated. Debugging and maintenance of code bases, like all of that can eventually be done by AI. And so like coding is kind of it's kind of like the first beachhead use case that's like so clearly an amazing killer app for LLMs. And we're like grappling with this process of like, okay, how do humans transition their role, get leverage from AI, figure out the best ways for them to plug in, but also like over time gradually become less and less relevant and more obsolete for a lot of these pieces. And so I do think like that journey will continue, and coding will probably be like the first use case where we see it play out. But I would expect similar things to happen in other spaces.
I guess, I feel like the Anthropic first cursor question is everyone's like favorite, where is the value end up accruing? Curious for both of you. Like obviously it seems like there's going to be a tremendous amount of enterprise value created in coding. We could put cognition in there too. Like who do you think ultimately ends up winning the majority of the space?
I mean, if I had to pick one, I would say Anthropic. I think that the companies like Cursor face so much platform risk. They've built an amazing product people love using. I know they're now trying to build their own models. I'm not super optimistic about Cursor's model building capabilities relative to Anthropic's. And Anthropic has obviously made building coding applications a huge priority with Claude Code and so forth. So Cursor's an amazing company. The growth is incredible. The team is amazing. The product is amazing. But I do think ultimately they have a pretty scary reliance on the underlying models from Anthropic.
Whoever has the best coding model on a given day will win on that day. I think engineers have no loyalty to any of these models. People on the team switch constantly. Everybody was using Claude Code on the team 2 months ago, and now most people are using Codex. And if Claude gets much better again, everyone's going to switch back to Claude.
If you were running, is there a way to make it sticky? Like if you were running Codex or Claude Code, like is there something you could do?
I mean, you think you have to get something about like memory of the code base, but the problem and like your interactions with it really kind of becoming sticky. But the problem is as the models get better and better at analyzing and inspecting code bases, then that memory becomes less important. Yeah. And then it starts to get towards this question where if you're building a company that's reliant upon this, how can you take the memory aspects that would be locked into Codex or to Claude and instead take those out of Codex and Claude and just provide that as part of the context. And now you can switch your entire pipeline between models really easily. So, Google always likes to say like our competition is just a click away. I feel like this is especially true in the coding landscape in a way that it's not true in a lot of places. And I think even already you see that even in enterprises, a lot of engineers have access to more than one of these models. So long term, it's very hard to actually kind of imagine building a durable moat and advantage here, because especially engineers are the folks who always want to try the new technology. They always want to go and do the best thing. They're not the sort of folks who say, oh, this is good enough. I just want to stay with this kind of as a community generally. In a lot of other fields, that is the case, right? In healthcare, if you deploy something that's doing transcription, doctors aren't going to want to learn a new tool. Engineers will. So I'm really unsure where the long-term durability comes here, and I do think this is a particularly big risk to the IDs, to Cursor and Bolt and Lovable, et cetera. Like, obviously, Anthropic would rather just capture that, or OpenAI would rather capture that. And in many ways, it's kind of similar to like Apple putting Apple Music on the same app store as Spotify. Apple doesn't have to pay the 30% fee. Right. Anthropic doesn't have to pay it's probably roughly actually in the 30s. Like, they don't have to pay the fee of using their own models. They get to pay at a cost. that's a huge durable structural advantage over these folks. So my guess is probably what you'll see is that the big model labs will be able to undercut the IDEs by quite a bit with respect to cost, and that will be meaningful. But then between the different models, and then also the open source models that are like Quencoder is already pretty good, it's hard to imagine the kind of people really sticking with one for a long time for me.
I guess another thing I'm curious for your take on, we're in San Francisco now. We're kind of releasing this like AI 64 app report, I believe, tomorrow. And you look at some of the best applications, and even, nearly half of them are all here in San Francisco as well. I guess begs the question for both of you, like, can you build a great AI company outside San Francisco? Like, how do you think about the geographic focus of the industry today?
I think definitely you can. There are different pros and cons about it, and I'm sure Rob will have some nice insights here. As Radical is primarily based in Toronto, although Rob's in the Bay. But look, being in the Bay means that you have access to a larger talent pool, which is really nice. You're in the center of the zeitgeist. All the folks that you want to talk to are local. That's really helpful. On the flip side, the talent's much more expensive in the Bay, and you're going to face a lot more competition. Like as a startup, it's very hard realistically to compete against the liquid comp offers that come out of OpenAI, Anthropic, Meta, Google, et cetera. If you're based in Toronto, there's less talent than there is in the Bay Area. There's still a lot because of the Vector Institute and University of Toronto, or in Zurich where there's ETH. You go to one of these places where there's a really strong feeder university for AI, and you will have less competition for the talent that's there, even though there's a little bit less talent.
Yeah, I mean, my somewhat tongue-in-cheek answer is like, yes, you definitely can build an AI company outside of SF, but why would you? And like, of course, sometimes like there are very real reasons why people are rooted in certain places, but I just think there's so much happening in SF, and it's so ground zero for everything in the world of AI in terms of the capital here, the talent here, just like the general zeitgeist and information flow. And, you learn things sooner in the Bay before they trickle out to other geographies. And so I think obviously talent is dispersed globally, but I do think that like there's pretty compelling reasons, no matter where you're from and where you start your company, to relocate to the Bay as you're growing. And to Ari's point, like there are definitely trade-offs with cost of labor. I think there are a lot of companies that have found clever ways to have some research teams located in other parts of the world, but still have a big go-to-market presence in San Francisco. And I think like if you're not going to be headquartered in San Francisco, I think like you almost certainly as an AI startup should at least have a presence and an office here. I just think it is like things move more quickly here, and being embedded deeply into this ecosystem is so important.
The osmosis that happens as you're like, just rubbing shoulders with everyone. It's just so clear. There's this really tight feedback loop. I mean, I think there was like that funny example of the Cursor team, like Ubering down to XAI HQ or something when like their new model wasn't working super well on Cursor, and they like resolved it in like 30 minutes. But I think certainly just the kind of like exchange of ideas between the cutting edge apps who are pushing the model companies in a bunch of different ways and have all sorts of different string evals and ways they fail, and the model companies themselves and who are pushing things. And I think that sharing of information is just really helpful to stay on the frontier of all these capabilities.
I think it's also a bit of a double-edged sword, in the sense that it's really great to be in the zeitgeist. It also, I think, makes it harder to actually go heads down and build.
I mean, another part of putting together this report that I thought was interesting and was curious to ask you about, Ari, is, everyone's always asking about moats in startups, and, trying to come up with a list. And one of my colleagues was like, well, data moats, like that should be a thing. And, it's always been unclear to me the extent to which that exists for an AI startup. But I figured no better person to have an opinion on this than you.
I would say generally not. I mean, ultimately, what is a data moat, right? It means you have access to a data set that nobody else has access to, or a very limited set of people have access to, and that is particularly relevant for the use cases that you're targeting. If that is the case, your data is incredibly valuable. And this is very true of lots of large enterprises that have lots of relevant data that they've been collecting for decades in many cases. That's extremely problem specific and relevant to their use cases. But startups usually don't have that sort of data.
But even on the large enterprise side, I'm always struck like how few examples it takes to effectively fine tune or do RL or whatever it is. Like, do you actually think the enterprise that has 100,000 examples versus 2,000 that the startup has, does it actually make that big a difference?
I think it does on specialized tasks. So I think that's where it becomes really important, right? And if you talk to most folks in the enterprise, you haven't seen these models deployed in most of these mission critical use cases. And it's not because they're at 95 and they need to be at 99.999. They're at like 50 in a lot of cases. They're quite far from being good. So I think there are particular use cases where you see RL being really impactful and really making a big impact. And obviously there's a large push towards this idea, hey, we can just use LM as judge and now we have verifiers and we can apply it to anything. But it's often a lot trickier than that to actually get it to really work. I mean, one thing that I think I liked from Andrej Karpathy's interview was talking about how LLMs as judge, oftentimes they have flaws in that they will reward something that they shouldn't, like a long string of numbers. And it's very hard to actually fully eliminate those. You can eliminate one, but it's kind of like a game of whack-a-mole. Whereas you do one, like then the system will optimize and find some other way around it. So I do think there's a massive benefit from actually having this relevant data. And if you think about it, another big aspect of this is that if you use a general purpose model for a specialized task, one, it's going to hallucinate more because in many cases, hallucinations are a byproduct of generality. And two, it's going to be a lot more expensive to deploy than a model that was specialized. So I think we're going to see a lot more of this. And increasingly, I think lots of enterprises are recognizing, okay, now we can actually start to do this and start to kind of close this gap on accuracy. So yeah, I actually do think there's a big data moat in enterprises. In startups, I think it's a lot harder. It would be know-how or something like that. And that can work as a moat and it can be hard as a moat in various ways.
One thing I was excited to get your thoughts on from the Karpathy interview was obviously he makes so many comparisons to the human brain. And you're a neuro PhD, so I feel like you're perfectly qualified here. But some of my favorite parts were talking about how we don't like RL our way to reasoning. We do with in the physical world, like you see babies put just about everything in their mouth and try a bunch of different things before they figure out how to walk some effective environment there. But and he said in some sense that's not surprising, right? I mean, it's we're building these models in very different ways than the human brain is developed. I don't have a more specific question than just I'd love to hear you, a very smart neuro AI person, riff on some of the things he was talking about.
Yeah, so unfortunately, I actually don't think we have that much to learn from the brain beyond high level thoughts. I really wanted to believe this, and actually, like, kind of when I changed fields from neuroscience to ML, the way I thought about it was very much like, oh, we know how to think about how the brain works. Surely this will be so useful for building better models. The reality is that the brain has a very different set of constraints than our models do. Most notably, the brain has to be extremely energy efficient. So it has to run on roughly 20 watts, which is nothing.
A little bit less than some of the data center sizes we're talking about.
Exactly. And there's also there's actually a really cool paper a while back showing that there's a hard trade-off between the time scale of a system and the amount of energy it uses. So like the brain functions on roughly a millisecond time scale, which is like not that fast. And if you want it to go faster, you need to use exponentially more energy. So there's like an evolutionary reason why we ended up kind of at a particular speed of processing. I think the places where this analogy, can be helpful is starting to look at it as a proof positive that we can do this so much more efficiently. I definitely agree that a lot of what we see that humans are able to do is baked in through evolution and through kind of building this like very compact system of DNA that can then build this very large emergence property system of the brain. That's really incredible. And I think we see a really clear analogy here. I like the analogy of pre-training is the same as kind of evolution. I think that really holds quite a bit of water. And what we see is that RL only works if the base model is good enough. Right. And all it's really doing is refining the outputs of the base model. And you can even in many cases do this without RL at all. Like there was a nice paper from Anthropic showing how you could do this without RL. And increasingly there are more and more papers showing that, RL isn't the key, it's actually having the right prior in there. So having the human brain as evidence that, hey, you can build something that, from birth can already start absorbing these sorts of contexts and can do it in a much more efficient way shows us that there are much better ways to do this. And in general, I'm a huge fan more like just across the board of rather than just saying throw more at it, just, hey, RL's not that efficient, just like throw more compute at it. But actually thinking, how do we actually increase the efficiency of these systems? Like you look at Grok 4 and they made a big deal about the fact that half of the compute was spent on RL, but the marginal gain of that additional half of compute was terrible. Like the ratio of kind of performance per dollar on the pre-training side was so much higher than the ratio of performance per dollar on the RL side. So as we start to invest more in these sorts of approaches, finding ways to actually make them more efficient, to actually get better propagation of signals and reward signals in particular is a hugely important problem for us to solve.
Before we wrap, I'd love to take a step back and ask you some overly broad, like zoom out questions for both of you. And so maybe to start, Rob, I'll start with you. Like reflecting on the last 2 years of AI investing or being in the AI ecosystem, in your case, Ari, what surprised you the most?
It's a good question. On the AI investing front, I guess I'd say a couple things. One is just like how wrong the like thin wrapper meme was in retrospect. And in retrospect, it should have been obvious that like there's so much value to be created at the application layer. I think there was like, rewinding the clock 2 years, I think there was just like so much fixation and obsession with the models. And like there's a phase where like everyone was really focused on like how many parameters does a given model have? And there's just like so much obsession about the model layer, and anything built on top of the model layer is, it's just a thin wrapper that's going to get destroyed. When in reality, like obviously that's where a huge amount of the value is going to end up accruing, because that's where the rubber actually hits the road in terms of these products being deployed into actual people's lives. There's now a newer question, which is like how much of that application layer value can the labs move up the stack and capture versus new startups. But I think the whole sort of dismissal of applications built on top of the foundation models as thin wrappers was like just I think a total like whiff by the entire VC community.
I actually think a lot of it could be attributed to like a single company, which is, I think, Jasper. People were so scared by like the rapid rise and then fall. Even though, look, Jasper, I think is still around and still doing some things, but I think there was such a concern that would happen to so many other AI apps. I'm not sure it's happened to any since then.
Yeah.
And it will. Like, there's no way all these things will work. But it's interesting how that was one of the first out of the gate that got a lot of publicity, and I think scared off a lot of people from investing in the app layer early.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I do think people overly rotated on that one example, and probably the pendulum swung too far. The other point, just from the investing perspective, that it has been surprising, I think took all of us by surprise, is but again, maybe should have been more obvious in retrospect, is just like how important the physical infrastructure underlying AI is. And I think like 2 years ago, very few investors were thinking about it. But in theory, you could have even gone back to like 2020 when the scaling law paper was published, and like if you really take scaling to its logical extreme, like it makes sense that would lead you to devoting like as much physical resources and energy and real estate as you can to scaling these models bigger and bigger. But I think like for a long time we sort of just abstracted away the physical inputs underlying AI, and now obviously that's kind of like the center of attention in terms of where the money is flowing.
What about for you, Ari?
I think one of the things that's been surprising to me is not that open models have converged for the most part in many cases with closed models. I think that was something that I always expected to generally happen, at least on the vast majority of tasks. But in particular, the success of Chinese models, I think, is not something that I necessarily would have predicted, and especially the amount of innovation that these teams are doing. DeepSeek drops a new paper, it's a must-read for the entire community. And I think this is also a place where the public perception is very, very off from the insider perspective. I think the public perspective is still very much China steals American IP. And that everything China's doing is because they have spies inside of OpenAI and Anthropic, and that's how they're producing such great models. That's just patently false. Like, they might have spies, I don't know. But like the fact that they need to in order to build great models, they're out innovating in a lot of ways.
Totally.
And like I think forcing China to buy H20s in the long run, I think, is going to be viewed as a very stupid decision in hindsight, because it catalyzed China to now build its own AI infrastructure and move off of NVIDIA sooner than it would have otherwise. And I said it earlier in the episode, constraints breed innovation. And we've seen that absolutely. They figured out ways to make things so much more dramatically efficient. And honestly, that's one thing that I'm really disappointed in the American AI ecosystem. I think that, again, the answer has just been throw money at the problem, and that will fix it. And like, look, if you have access to effectively infinite capital, maybe that does make sense as a strategy. Maybe that's the faster route. But I don't think that's the best route. I think a much better route is to think really deeply about where the bottlenecks are in these systems. Like scaling laws are terrible. Power laws suck. Like every time you 10x the data or compute, you get a diminishing return. You can't do that forever. It's not a surprise that things like 4.5 didn't work super well if you just naively kind of extrapolate this out. There have to be better ways for us to do this. And I think that the most exciting work in that direction of making these models most efficient is coming not just from like one Chinese lab, but from like 10 Chinese labs. I don't think I would have called that.
Why isn't it happening in like U.S. academia where they have compute constraints as well?
Well, one big thing is that the compute constraints in U.S. academia are much more severe. So there's a Goldilocks zone that you need. And honestly, it's one thing that just very much worries me. Like I feel like this is 1960 again. We're in the space race, and rather than deepening our investment in the academic infrastructure, we're cutting our investments in academic infrastructure. China is directly funding a lot of universities, with compute to be able to build these models. We're pulling compute from many, resources from many universities. That's scary to me in the long term. I think we need to really be investing. I think that's why you see, NVIDIA in particular, really trying very hard to build up a more robust open model ecosystem in the West.
Well, what I was going to say, actually very similar to what you were saying, Rob. I mean, clearly, from the investing standpoint, the lesson of the last 2 years was apps was a great place to invest. And I think everyone's now rushing into them now, having realized, man, I wish I'd done even more in 23 and 24. A cousin maybe to the fear of them all being wrappers was also this idea that incumbents were really well positioned to do some of this. And I think I've been surprised on the relative lack of success of a lot of incumbents. I mean, GitHub Copilot was in a really good place to capture coding, Salesforce in customer support, some of the other use cases. And I think what maybe now is more clear is that building AI products is just like so different than traditional product management. And I think honestly, even the relationship these companies have with their end customers is very different. If I think about like traditional software companies, like, they go preview their roadmap with their customers. Like, we're going to do this next quarter, this the quarter after. Their customers expect things to be like super, reliable and rolled out to their whole employee base. And then I think about some of my AI portfolio companies. They're basically throwing like 30 things at the wall. 25 of them don't work. 3 of them are kind of interesting and like 2 really hit. But their customers also, that's what their customers expect. Their customers love that they're taking 30 kind of half-baked, but like maybe could work ideas, throwing them off. Like that's exactly what they want that vendor to do. And so I almost wonder whether, or in retrospect, it's like these newer companies are so much better positioned to be just like the thought and experimentation partner to a lot of these enterprises than I would have expected. I would have thought the incumbents would have had the trust to be doing that. But it's both very different way to build product and also a different kind of relationship with those end customers.
One comment on the wrapper thing. I also agree that certainly that story got a lot more play than maybe it should have in hindsight. At the same time, I don't think that story is fully written yet.
No, totally.
And in particular, I think we're going to see in the coming years a pretty big bifurcation between which wrapper companies survive and which wrapper companies do not. And I think that my guess is that the wrapper companies that are much more vertical specific will do a lot better than the wrapper companies that are a lot more generic. Like the reason I think Jasper was particularly hit right at the beginning was it was for writing, which is what ChatGPT was really good at from the get-go. As you can see where all the frontier labs are going with their roadmaps with this pretty clearly. There are a lot of wrapper companies that I think are in direct line of sight of those various products, and I do expect that many of them will get hurt fairly hard. But like I am less confident that OpenAI is going to go after lots of individual verticals. So it's like there's this Goldilocks zone that you need to hit here in like a min-max problem. If it needs to be in a big enough market that it's interesting and it's worth building something, but it can't be too big, because if it's too big, then it's obviously something that one of the major players is going to go after. And some of them, and especially when you start to think about the distribution advantages that some of them has, that starts to really be a question. So I'm curious to see how this will continue to evolve over the next couple of years, but I do think some wrapper companies will be in trouble.
Yeah. No, it's funny that the Goldilocks zone is now a $50 to $100 billion opportunity. It's probably maybe too small for your $500 billion ambitious company. Also, I want to hit Rob. Obviously, you do some great writing, and one of my favorite pieces you'd written in the past was just speculating on all these potential acquisitions that might happen. It feels like there's more and more, momentum behind, God, Apple needs to do something. And they're the last player not to really have a defined strategy. To make you kind of speculate here, What do you think they would go buy?
Yeah, I mean, the challenge is that Apple is just not, they're not super acquisitive in general, and when they do buy, they don't do big splashy acquisitions, and so we'll see how willing they are to like break out of that very entrenched habit. But I guess if I were to sort of conceptually speculate, what would make sense for them to sort of supercharge their AI aspirations, because obviously they've been very slow moving and a laggard relative to other hyperscalers. I think there's a couple categories I could envision. I think one is like, compared to other hyperscalers, certainly like Google, Meta, Microsoft, and its relationship with OpenAI, Apple doesn't have a super deep bench of cutting edge AI talent. They don't have a really deep, really cracked LLM generative AI team. And so I could see it making sense for them to just do almost like a Google DeepMind type acquisition, where they just get this brain trust of top AI folks, because there really aren't that many of them in the world still. And so, in terms of what company that is, someone like a Reflection or like a Mistral, at this point, both of those companies' valuations are so high, maybe they're priced out, but sort of like a similar caliber talent that maybe hasn't raised as much money. And there aren't a ton of these top-notch AI teams out there that are independent, but there are some. So I think that's one category I can imagine. And then a second category would be a real killer application that they could add to the iPhone ecosystem that already has a huge user base. So I think the obvious example here is Perplexity, and there were rumors over the past year that Apple was thinking pretty seriously about buying Perplexity. I think they're probably priced out of that one too at this point, just given the valuations at which Perplexity has raised. But I think if there is another consumer mobile application like that just catches fire and has a lot of user love and user loyalty, I could see an acquisition like that making sense.
Yeah.
One comment on the Apple direction that I think is interesting. I think Apple has such a huge opportunity here, and I think if they can execute, this can actually really be a major moment for Apple, because I think there's a narrative that makes a ton of sense for Apple, which is, hey, you have an on-device model that's entirely private, that's going to know you very well, but you don't have to worry about anything with respect to privacy or sending to the cloud, any of that. That just makes very much a lot of sense for Apple. And if you think about one of Apple's big challenges over the last decade, it's that as the improvement in each successive iPhone cycle diminished, the incentive to buy a new phone has proportionally diminished as well. And you see people now using phones for 5 years plus, right? Whereas even kind of people who love tech using phones for a very long time. And what we've seen is that Apple's revenue growth has shifted to a lot of the services sort of businesses, right? To growing Apple Music and Apple TV and things like that. Well, if Apple's new value prop is, hey, we have really strong models that are fully private, that are fully local on your device. Now there's a huge incentive to buy a new iPhone, because each successive iPhone is going to be able to support a more powerful model.
Yeah, the hardware improvements really matter.
So now hardware improvements matter a lot again. And that's a huge opportunity for Apple in particular. So if they can, work this out and build a really great on-device model, I think it could actually be really a supercharge for them with respect to their revenue growth beyond the model itself, by just really putting a huge incentive to grow better hardware.
There's a lot of discussion around what is the new consumer hardware form factor going to be for AI? I think it could end up being the iPhone. They have such great distribution already, and so I think they're still in a very good position despite the fact that they've moved very slow.
Also, people still use Siri. And Siri is not very good, but it's the default. So that's what everybody uses. They don't need to have a model that is competitive with the best models out there. They need to have a model that's good enough for most people, and that'll be a massive upgrade for what most people are used to. So I think they can get there. I also will note, Apple does have a number of really talented researchers in the machine learning research group, which incidentally is actually one of the most open groups in all of industry. This is a group led by Sami Bengio, and they have a number of really talented folks there. That said, I think those folks tend to be more science-minded than product-minded. And I think they're kind of siloed from a lot of the rest of Apple, and that kind of structural disadvantage makes it harder, I think, for them to contribute.
I'm really interested in that point you just made of they just need a good model, not necessarily state of the art. I think this is a question I'm curious for both your thoughts on, of is it good? The price they'd have to pay to be state of the art versus 6 months behind state of the art, so different, right? And it's interesting. You see a company like Meta, they're paying up because they've decided like they want to take a shot at being state of the art. Does Apple need a state of the art model? Does Meta need a state of the art model?
I think the question you have to ask is what use cases are enabled by the difference between the state of the art model and the 6-month lagging model? And how relevant are those use cases to the user base that you want to support? And I think the answer already is like pretty minimally. Like most consumers don't need a really powerful reasoning model for basically anything. There will be a small subset of folks that will really use reasoning, but the vast majority of people are not going to be using it for that. They're going to ask for a summary of a movie, or they're going to ask for like really basic things that models are already really good at, or they're going to want to talk to it as a companion. You know, they chat with it like a therapist or things like that. Models are already plenty good at these sorts of things.
Yeah, I really like the way Ari framed it, that like it really does come down to what are the commercial use cases and end markets that you care about. And so I think like for Google, I think they do need to be at the frontier because so much of what they're building and they're offering via search and Gmail and calendar and kind of managing people's personal productivities can benefit so much from having the latest and greatest technologies. I don't think Apple probably needs state-of-the-art massive frontier models. I think to Ari's point, like efficiency and edge models matter a lot more. And then a company like Meta, like I also don't think it's clear that they need to have frontier models. I think maybe what you'll see is that like different groups will end up specializing in different directions that are more relevant to them. So maybe Meta ends up going super hard on multimodal and ends up pushing the frontier on video models because that's so central to what they're building. But like, does MSL really need to be building state-of-the-art cutting edge language models that are, you know, that continue to stay on par with OpenAI and Anthropic? Like, it's not totally clear to me that that necessarily makes sense.
Yeah. I kind of disagree though, because I feel like there's a probability distribution of like what these models' capabilities will be in a few years, and there's a chance that there's some killer consumer features that are unlocked by these models getting state of the art, and whether it's computer use or the ability to like more effectively reason across your entire life. And to the extent that Meta, Apple are competing to be like that homepage for your like day-to-day life, there is some chance that the improvement in the underlying models, that for 6 months they don't have that and someone else does. And I wonder if that's enough to switch people over, or whether these things are so sticky that, hey, okay, sure, ChatGPT had that for 6 months and the iPhone gets it 6 months later, no harm, no foul. But there's clearly, this is all in probabilities, and I think those companies probably will end up being like, it's worth it just to make sure there's not some moment where we are behind on some major capability.
I mean, just like rolling that out for a second, right? Yeah. So let's imagine there's like a really great computer use model that OpenAI puts out, where you have to download the OpenAI app in order to get really great computer use, on Mac. And say Apple deploys something that's, 50% as good a year later. Most people will not have downloaded the ChatGPT app in that interim and actually really started to use it. I think there will be a subset of folks that will do that. But most people's first exposure to that will be when it ships with macOS by default, and it's like an Apple branded product. I think especially Apple has an advantage here over Microsoft because people love Apple. Yeah. When Windows says, "Hey, try Copilot," most people are like, "No, I don't want that." But if Apple says, "Hey, look at this magical macOS, Apple Intelligence," and it's reasonably good and it can do things, most regular people are going to love that, and they're going to go to the thing that's easy and sticky. And then when they upgrade their Mac, if it's good enough, they're going to continue to use it. Like, it's still very surprising to me how many people use Apple Maps. Yeah. But they do. And that's where most of the market growth is going to be. It's going to be in, folks that are not clued in tightly to the AI ecosystem. And I think in general, this is actually, going back to the SF thing, this can be a downside of being in the SF bubble, right? You're only exposed to people who are very up to date about this, who are thinking about this, who have very willingness to try new products. And that's not actually representative of the rest of the world.
My last question for you guys is just, outside of running your company and running your investing, like, what are some of the larger just AI-related questions that you found yourself pondering over the last few weeks, and things that are kind of in the back of your mind that you continually find yourself returning to?
I mean, I brought this up on the last podcast as well, but I'll just continue to be a hype man.
And I saw you were on TBPN pumping it. You're a big BCI guy.
Yeah. I got to keep the BCI train rolling. There's just so many interesting intersections between the human brain and AI, and like Ari was talking conceptually about like what can we learn from human cognition and the way the brain is structured to building artificial neural networks. But I also think it's just a fascinating question from an interface perspective. I mean, we're talking about Apple and iPhones and potentially other hardware form factors, but it does, to me, it seems like it's just a matter of time until you're able to directly connect and interface with AI using your brain and using your thoughts. And the more time I've spent in this space over the past year, the more convinced I've become that moment is coming sooner than most people think. So I think there's a lot of really fascinating research and innovation happening in the BCI space. I think this dichotomy between invasive BCI, where you need to do surgery, which obviously like increases the barrier to entry a lot, versus non-invasive BCI, which can be more consumer type products, and how much is possible non-invasively versus, for what use cases do you need to put electronics inside the skull? I think there's a lot still to figure out there, but I do think that this, in the next 18 to 36 months, I think this will become a much more mainstream topic of conversation.
Certainly if you keep plugging it on the podcast.
That's my hope.
I will note, as a founder, it's hard to think about much else in the AI list, especially independent of how it relates directly to Datology. But one of the aspects that we already touched on here a bit that I've been thinking a lot about is how do we continue to find the efficient way to continue to scale things, right? How do we do this in a way where we don't just think about what enables the next improvement, but how can we actually get a sustainable scaling access that we can continue to do in a way that doesn't require us to, build many new nuclear power plants or things like that. I think there's a lot that we can do here, and finding ways we can do that better is, I think, really exciting. And I think another big aspect of this is also, as we see increasingly the value of methods for customizing models like RL, how can we make that more effective through better models? Like, how do you actually build models that are really good for RL? We know that there's a tremendous amount of variability here. Realistically, it all comes down to what data you show the model in free training, which is true of most things. But kind of figuring out, how do you actually link this, and how do you think about the model building process holistically rather than kind of as separate steps, I think is a really exciting direction.
Yeah, I feel like mine's far lamer by comparison, but if you'd asked me a year ago, like, what are the AI app categories that are working, I would have said, coding, support, healthcare, legal, probably the big four. If you ask me that today, I'd say probably those same four. And so I wonder whether, we're just talking about a diffusion issue, and like there actually are a lot of, with this current set of model capabilities, a ton of other great, industries that will be disrupted in a bunch of different ways. Or whether actually we need some sort of improvement in models, or, some of this specific data that goes into these models to make better before like the next wave of companies comes. It's interesting that in a space that is moving so fast, that actually has stayed somewhat static over the last year.
Totally.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, Rob, this is such a blast. I really, it's just so fun to get to do this. I really appreciate you both taking the time.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us back again, and to do it in person this time.